Somewhere in America right now, there is a church basement that still smells the same way it did in 1954. Folding tables pushed end to end, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and somewhere on that table, once upon a time, sat a dessert that nobody makes anymore. A dessert that cost less than $1, fed 30 people, and was regarded by everyone in that congregation as the finest thing they had ever put in their mouths. What happened to those desserts? Why did they disappear? And what do they tell us about the country that created them? My name is Nathan Carter. I've spent years tracking down the forgotten corners of American history, the abandoned roads, the lost inventions, the stories that never made the textbooks. But every now and then, the most revealing history isn't found in an archive. Sometimes it's found in a recipe box.
To understand the church potluck dessert, you have to understand what America looked like in the 1950s, and particularly what it looked like for the women who built that culture from scratch. The post-war decade was, on the surface, a story of prosperity. Factory work had ended. Veterans had come home. Suburbs were expanding outward from every major American city at a pace that had no precedent in the country's history. And the church, Protestant, Catholic, across nearly every denomination, was the center of community life in a way that is genuinely difficult to recover today. Attendance rates at American churches in the 1950s reached their highest recorded levels in the 20th century. Gallup data from that period consistently showed more than 40% of Americans reporting weekly attendance.
And the potluck supper, the fellowship dinner, the covered dish social, was the gravitational center of that community life. It was where people actually knew each other. But here is something that the nostalgic version of this story almost always leaves out. The women who made those potlucks happen were working under real constraints, real budgets, real time pressures. $1 was not an insignificant sum in 1950s America, particularly in rural congregations, mill towns, and working-class parishes where a family might tithe 10% of a modest weekly wage and still find a way to bring something beautiful to the table. That tension between scarcity and generosity is where the real history lives. The desserts that emerged from this era were not accidents of taste, they were engineering solutions. Every recipe was a negotiation between what ingredients cost, what a home kitchen could reliably produce, and what the women of the congregation would regard as genuinely impressive. These were competitive spaces, though nobody would have called them that. The woman who brought the dessert everyone talked about for 3 weeks earned a form of social currency that mattered deeply in those communities. Consider the icebox cake. Today, it sounds almost too simple to mention. Layers of whipped cream and chocolate wafer cookies, assembled and refrigerated overnight. But in the early 1950s, a home refrigerator was still a relatively new appliance for many American families. The icebox cake was, in a very real sense, a celebration of technology. It required no oven, it required no precise technique, and it produced something that looked and tasted, according to every account from the period, genuinely elegant. But the icebox cake is only the beginning, because the 1950s potluck dessert landscape was far stranger and far more interesting than most people realize. There was the tomato soup cake, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the reaction most people have today is identical to the reaction food historians have when they first encounter it in period cookbooks. A spiced layer cake, moist and dense, made with a can of condensed tomato soup in place of milk or buttermilk. The recipe appeared in a Campbell's Soup cookbook that was distributed widely in the early 1950s, and according to food scholars who have tested and documented it, the cake is genuinely delicious. The tomato flavor disappears entirely, and what remains is a warmly spiced cake with an unusually tender crumb. This was not an aberration. It was a window into how home bakers of the post-war era thought about ingredients. The processed foods arriving on grocery shelves, condensed soups, packaged gelatin, canned fruits, evaporated milk, were not seen as compromises. They were seen as tools, modern, reliable, time-saving tools that any resourceful cook could turn into something remarkable.
The Jell-O mold dessert occupies a chapter of its own in this story, and it is a genuinely complex chapter, because the history of gelatin in American cooking is the history of aspiration and class anxiety playing out on a serving table. Gelatin had been a luxury item throughout the 19th century. Making it from scratch required boiling animal bones for hours, straining the result multiple times, and producing something that was, as culinary historian Laura Shapiro has written, primarily a signal of household wealth, because it required both time and domestic labor to execute. When powdered gelatin and then flavored gelatin products became widely available and affordable in the early 20th century, they democratized that signal. Suddenly, a working-class family could present a shimmering, molded dessert that implied a level of domestic sophistication once reserved for much wealthier households. By the 1950s, the Jell-O mold dessert had reached its cultural apex. The variations were extraordinary. Lime gelatin with crushed pineapple and cream cheese, a combination that sounds improbable until you taste it and realize it is essentially a proto-cheesecake in suspended form. Orange gelatin with mandarin oranges and shredded coconut, strawberry molds with whole berries embedded like artifacts in amber. These were not frivolous creations. Culinary historians who specialize in mid-century American food culture have argued persuasively that the Jell-O mold represented something important: the desire of post-war American women to create beauty within constraint.
The ingredients were cheap. The technique was forgiving, but the visual result, turned out perfectly onto a serving platter and carried down a church hall, was striking in a way that a simple layer cake simply was not. Here is the revelation that this story saves for its second half, and it is one that most people who grew up eating these desserts never knew. Many of the recipes that appeared in church cookbooks, community fundraiser booklets, and women's magazine columns during the 1950s were not originally home inventions at all. They were the product of test kitchens operated by food companies: General Mills, Kraft, Pillsbury, Campbell's, Jell-O's parent company General Foods, staffed almost entirely by professional home economists, the vast majority of them women with formal university training in food science and domestic economics. These women, many of whom worked under fictional corporate personas like Betty Crocker, who was never a real person, were among the most influential food scientists of the 20th century. They reverse-engineered recipes to work reliably in the widest possible range of home ovens, with the cheapest available ingredients, and distributed them through a network of cookbooks, magazine advertising, and promotional materials that reached millions of American households. When a woman in a church basement in Akron, Ohio, made a tomato soup cake in 1953, she may have thought of it as her recipe. It was in many ways. She had made it her own, adjusted it, passed it to neighbors. But its origin was a corporate test kitchen in New Jersey, staffed by professionally trained food scientists pursuing a very specific commercial objective.
That history doesn't make the cake less delicious or the community around it less real, but it does complicate the nostalgia, and it reveals something true about how American food culture has always worked. The line between domestic tradition and corporate engineering was never as clear as the mythology suggests. The disappearance of these desserts began in the 1970s, accelerated through the 1980s, and was largely complete by the time the internet arrived and began telling people that their grandmother's recipes were either too simple or too strange. The church potluck itself declined as church attendance fell, and as the cultural pressure on women that had made those suppers possible, the expectation of hours of unpaid domestic labor was rightly and necessarily challenged. What was lost in that process, alongside the inequality that had sustained it, was something worth grieving: a culture of everyday creativity practiced under constraint, passed between women who knew each other's names, in buildings that smelled of coffee and folding chairs, and something sweet cooling on a table. Every time I track down one of these forgotten histories, I find the same thing underneath: not simplicity, but ingenuity; not nostalgia, but evidence. The church potluck dessert wasn't just food. It was the record of how ordinary American women fed a community with almost nothing,
and made it look effortless. That is a story worth recovering. There's another forgotten chapter of American domestic history waiting to be uncovered, one that reaches into the kitchens, the factories, and the social movements that shaped how this country eats. Join me next time.